In these Clinton-esque times, I think it's very important to realize that if we look at the period when the United States was founded as a country in 1780, matters were very different in the way the president was regarded. The president about whom I'm speaking, George Washington, had a nearly universal outstanding reputation. This was based primarily, of course, on his victory against the British. Remember, the British were the most powerful army in the world, and Washington, especially in his victory in October 1781 at the Battle of Yorktown against Lord Cornwallis, had defeated the British Army. This was, you have to imagine the situation. It's a even less than third-rate power. It defeated the greatest army in the world. Now, one could, and some people have, raised questions about how good Washington really was as a general. Thomas Paine wrote an open letter to Washington in September 1796. He was very angry at Washington because Paine had been a delegate to the French National Convention, and he had been imprisoned and was faced execution by the Jacobins. Paine was a member of the somewhat more moderate Girondist party. He blamed Washington for not doing enough to get him out. So in his open letter, he said that what Washington had done as a general was essentially to do nothing. He had simply stayed away from the British as much as possible. But one could argue against Paine that that was actually his great virtue, that he had avoided, although he had only one decisive victory, that was really enough, and he'd done a great deal to defeat the British. But his prestige didn't rest only on his military attainments. Even more important at that time was that after winning the war, he went to Congress, the Continental Congress at Annapolis, and resigned his commission. He didn't seek any power, but simply went into retirement. And at that time in American history, people tended to draw parallels with classical antiquity. They were extremely important. And Washington was compared with the Roman soldier Cincinnatus, who had been a farmer, and then he had been called by the Romans, had rescued a blockaded Roman army in 458 BC. He'd become temporarily dictator, but after winning the battle, he resigned his dictatorship and simply went back to his farm. So Washington was viewed as, like Cincinnatus, as a great, very virtuous person. He had had a chance to, since he was commander of the army, he had had a chance possibly to establish himself as a monarch, but instead of doing that, he said to the Congress he had fulfilled his mission and now was going into retirement. And Lord Byron called him, Washington, the Cincinnatus of the West. Now, given this very high prestige for Washington, it led people to what I think is a rather strange argument, people at the time. They said something like this: if Washington supports a particular measure or particular act, then it must be good. It must have something in it, or at least if we have doubts about this measure, we should overlook them or at least downgrade them, because after all, Washington, who is the greatest and most virtuous man of his time, is supporting these measures. Well, you can see this is not a terribly good argument, because even if it's true that Washington was such an outstanding person in virtue of matter I'm not going to really get into in this talk, it still wouldn't follow that the measures of government he supported were good ones. I mean, we couldn't imagine a very virtuous person or a very outstanding military leader who really had bad ideas about politics and government, and so that if people supported him on the grounds of that argument, they would be making a big mistake. But nevertheless, that was an extremely popular position at that time. So it becomes very important then, given that people had this view, namely if Washington supports a measure or supports some plan, they were themselves inclined to support it, to ask, what was Washington's view of government? Now, here again we have to remember the 1780s was a very different time from the present. Nowadays, people who favor strictly limited government or the free market tend very often to say they support strictly constitutional government. They favor, say, strict construction of the Constitution versus the very loose construction of the Constitution favored by the modern Supreme Court. We must remember, in the 1780s, before the Constitution was enacted, the Constitution was not a move in the direction of limited government, was a move very much towards centralized power. Under the Articles of Confederation, which was in effect before the Constitution was established, the states were virtually sovereign bodies. You remember, in fact, in the Treaty of Peace ending the war in 1783, the former colonies are listed separately in the treaty, as the Great Britain is said to have made an agreement with each of the separate colonies, not with the United States as a whole. And under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress could not tax without consent of the states. All money had to be voted by the states themselves to Congress. Further, any changes in the Articles of Confederation had to be made by unanimous consent of the states, and it was always, or almost always, impossible to get all the states to agree. Rhode Island was one state that almost never agreed to any changes that the other states wanted. So now, Washington thought this was a very bad system, and he favored a much more centralized system, and he played a crucial role in getting together the Constitutional Convention. He had been in the early planning, even before the Annapolis Convention of 1786. He had been, which only 5 states participated in. He had been at a preliminary meeting in Mount Vernon, his home, designed to get together plans for a more centralized government. If we look at what happened at the Constitutional Convention, with, of course, again, Washington, when the convention opened in May 1787, was immediately elected president unanimously. Again, Washington was far and away the most revered figure of the time, and everyone favored him. And although he didn't say much at the convention, he was very much in on the major planning, particularly of his fellow delegates from Virginia. And James Madison, who is generally called the father of the Constitution, when he was proposing his famous Virginia plan for the Constitution, wrote out a summary of the plan, prepared it for Washington, and got Washington's approval in advance. And we can see, what is this Virginia plan that Washington approved of? It was a much more radical plan than what was actually put into effect in the Constitution itself, of the states tremendously, and established a much more centralized government. Of course, this was not voted for by the Constitutional Convention, but you can see that the plan that Madison had and Washington approved it was very much in favor of a centralized government. I should mention the historian Lance Banning, whose probably the top authority on Madison, in his recent book, Sacred Fire of Liberty, argues that this plan wasn't so centralized at all. He says, and I think his argument strikes me as very much going against his conclusion, he says, well, this wasn't that centralized a plan because, after all, the power to veto any state law was similar to the power that the British monarch had through the Privy Council of vetoing any measure of the colonies. But one might ask, well, why isn't this just an example showing it was centralized, that they would be the powers of the national government would be equivalent to those of the British monarch, similar to those that the United States, the colonies that supposedly revolted against, that Madison seemed to want to reestablish and Washington accepted. Further, Washington favored a very strong executive power. In the American Revolution, there had been, of course, a great movement against a strong executive. You remember in the Declaration of Independence, there's a long list of grievances that directed specifically against the king, George III, that said he has done such and such and so. Then there are other grievances that start for having done such and so, and those refer to Parliament. But there are a whole lot directed specifically at the king. So the movement in the colonies, during the Revolution, was completely away from strong executive power. And in fact, in the Articles of Confederation, the president of the Continental Congress virtually had no power at all. But Washington very much went against this, and he favored an extremely strong executive. And again, the delegates at the convention went along with this to a great extent because of Washington himself. They realized that the first president, if there was going to be a president, would be Washington. Of course, since he was such a great and virtuous person, there wouldn't be any question of abuse of power under him. So they voted for a rather stronger executive than they perhaps would have voted for had this figure of such tremendous prestige not been there. When Washington actually became president, he was very much going, as one might expect, going in the line of a strong ruler. He had almost all the cabinet departments were directly under his control. The officers would have to report directly to him in written reports, and on all matters except financial and economic, which I'll get into a bit later, he had to approve everything the government did. He was also, in spite of his having earlier rejected the chance to become king, if indeed there was such a possibility when he given up command of the army, he was at least somewhat monarchical in his approach to the president. He wanted to be called His Mightiness the President of the United States. And he only abandoned this when people laughed at him. I think he never forgave the Speaker of the House for laughing at this title. But at first, there was John Adams was very much one who supported strong court ceremonial. At first, it seemed as if the presidency would be almost a replica of the British court, although this wasn't. This was later abandoned. Now, things, as I say, thus moved so far. Washington favored a much more centralized government, but unfortunately, this doesn't come to the end of Washington's moves in the direction of a more powerful and less limited government. You remember I said that he had direct control over everything. He exercised direct control over everything in his administration, particularly the War Department, which he was a genuine expert, and also State Department and diplomacy, in which he considered himself an expert. But with one exception, this was finance and economics. And here, the control was exercised by his former military aide, who was also his most influential advisor, Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hamilton was a strong supporter of even more centralized government than Washington. During the Constitutional Convention, he had said that he supported monarchy as the best form of government, and which was not a position likely to win him much popularity. And after he gave that speech, he didn't say much more on the topic, but that accurately reflected his views. So he was an extraordinarily intelligent person. The historian Forrest MacDonald, who's a great admirer of Hamilton, calls Hamilton in the most brilliant bastard in American history. Now, what Hamilton's policy was, which again had the approval of Washington, and again, once Washington approved this policy, again, people would tend to abandon whatever objections they had to it, was one of strong economic nationalism and interference with the free market. One example of this came out in 1790 in the proposal to assume the state debts. During the Revolutionary War, you'll recall, most of the states had run up enormous debts, and they had a great deal of trouble paying them. And there was a great deal of controversy over what was to be done about these debts. Should they be paid off in full, which is what Washington favored? Should they be paid in part with sort of the present value to certain of the bondholders, which was Jefferson and Madison favored, or all sorts of other plans. There were some who favored kind of a Rothbardian policy of total repudiation of the debt, but this was a very unpopular one. Now, the key here to Hamilton's policy is not so much that he wanted to assume the state debts, but it was that he didn't want to pay off the debt and then just have the government, the state government or the national government, just operate on a balanced budget. He thought that they should fund the debt, which is the government would pay people the interest on the bonds, but then would continue more and more borrowing. Hamilton initiated the policy of that's been so popular ever since, of having government deficit finance. He thought the debt was a very good thing, and American Keynesians such as Alvin Hansen and others have recognized that Hamilton was an important predecessor of their views. Further, Hamilton favored strong protective tariffs using the so-called infant industries argument. And again, Washington went along with this. One of the actual disadvantages of the Articles of Confederation had been that the states could impose taxes and tariffs on each other's goods, but this, of course, might have been remedied by other means in a constitution, such as a free trade agreement. But even though now, and one of the genuine advantages of the Constitution was that there was free trade among the states can't impose duties on each other's goods, Hamilton, and with Washington backing him up, partly negated the value of this by having a policy of protective tariffs. And this, of course, played a crucial role much later on in leading to the Civil War because of Southern resentment against tariffs that benefited the northern states. But there was an even more basic assault on limited government that came later by Hamilton, and this involved his proposal of a national bank for the United States. The crucial fact here, I think, is not so much the economic particulars of having a national bank, but the constitutional issue that this raised. There appears to be an overwhelming objection to the government establishing a national bank, which is that the Constitution says nothing at all about Congress or any other part of the government having the power to establish such a bank. Further, the 10th Amendment, the Bill of Rights, which the states insisted on as for ratification, seems specifically to prohibit the government from assuming new powers. It says all powers not delegated by this Constitution to the government, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So this seems to rule out a national bank altogether, even if one took the view, which I think is a wrong one, that a national bank was desirable. It seems that there would be nothing one could do about it short of having a constitutional amendment to establish it. But Hamilton would not let anything like the Constitution stand in his way. And he, at request of Washington, he submitted an analysis, a report on the constitutionality of the bank. And he advanced in this some arguments that have been crucial to the subsequent development of statism in our country. One was, he said that he used the famous argument of the elastic clause, that Congress has, in one phrase of the Constitution, has the power to enact all measures necessary and proper to putting into effect whatever powers they've been granted. So he took this necessary and proper clause to mean that the Congress could establish even measures that aren't specifically mentioned. They could, even though a bank, there's nothing said about a bank, as long as it was thought necessary and proper to establish some sort of governmental function, which he took in a very broad way, Congress could do it. So there would be practically no limitation at all on the power of the government if this interpretation was accepted. Now, you might think, well, how would Hamilton get around the 10th Amendment, which seems to say, go against this and says, no, any power is not delegated to the government or reserved to the states or to the people. How would he get around that? Well, he was a very good lawyer. Again, he resembles the present occupant of the White House in his ability to come up with unexpected nuances of words. And he pointed out that the 10th Amendment doesn't say all powers expressly delegated by the government to the Constitution are reserved to the not expressly delegated or reserved to the states or to the people. It just says all powers delegated. So this left it open for these indirect powers, the powers that weren't specifically mentioned, to be given to the central government. And in Hamilton's view, the 10th Amendment virtually did nothing. It really it had almost no limitations at all, imposed no limitations at all on the power of the government. So this interpretation of this very expansive interpretation of the power of the national government and this evisceration of the 10th Amendment was accepted by Washington when he signed the bill authorizing the Bank of the United States in February 1791. So Washington then accepted the basic premise of been crucial for the subsequent development of statism, namely that the Constitution doesn't impose extremely strict limits on Congress, but through the necessary and proper clause, Congress is in a position to do much more than one might have imagined just by reading the specific language of the Constitution. Now, I should mention there's an obvious objection to my argument, I'm sure you all thought of, that when I've been arguing that Washington's prestige led people to accept, or at least not to object to, as much as they otherwise might have, to statist measures. What about the farewell address? Isn't this sort of the founding document of a non-interventionist foreign policy? And indeed it is, and I think one must give credit here to Washington for, in this sense, his policies moved strongly in the direction that supported limited government. What the policy in the farewell address, I should say the farewell address is not an actual speech. It's an article that Washington drafted in September 1796. It was published in the American Gazette, which was the official newspaper, setting forward certain principles of government and that he was giving when he retired from the presidency. There's a lot of controversy on who helped in the draft. There's some people think that Hamilton really wrote most of the farewell address, but this has been disputed. But in this address, Washington gives some principles that I think very much move in an anti-statist direction in foreign policy. He warns against what he calls inveterate antipathies toward particular states or attachments to other states. And he suggests that Europe has a set of concerns that are very distinct from those of the United States, and that the United States should avoid intervention in these concerns. The European power politics are essentially not an American concern, and we should stay out of them, and as he said, avoid permanent alliances. So this is his policy there, as I say, has had very beneficial results in the sense that throughout American history, people have appealed to Washington's farewell address as a reason to avoid entering the war, even down to World War II. Opponents of American intervention in the war appealed to the principles of the farewell address. Unfortunately, since I like to spoil everything, I must say there's a problem in this use of this argument. Again, we have the fundamental what I think is fallacious argument. Since Washington supported a policy, therefore it must be a good one. Again, people sometimes seem to be arguing, since Washington favored non-intervention, then we ought to support this policy. But I think at least it's a less bad argument in that it has good consequences. Maybe it's all right to use bad arguments if they have beneficial consequences. But more seriously, Washington in the farewell address actually gave good arguments for non-intervention, as the kind I mentioned, specifically that the U.S. had separate interests from those of Europe and should avoid interferences in European affairs. And it's interesting, if we look at later presidents who have gone against Washington, the non-interventionist policy, they have the farewell address very much in mind. For example, Harry Truman, in his memoirs, who of course helped inaugurated the Cold War, expresses very much resentment against the fact that it's a tradition for a member of the Senate to read the farewell address every year. And he said he was pretty sick of this, and he said this was used by organizations such as the America First Committee and the Ku Klux Klan. You notice how, with typical subtlety, Truman links these two organizations. So he said this, of course, was outdated. We couldn't use this now. And he recognizes the great prestige, even then, of Washington's policies. But even though, as I say, we have to give Washington credit for the non-interventionist policy of the farewell address, I think on balance he was still very much a supporter of centralized government. We can see in later American history how much appeals to Washington helped support the moves towards centralization. For example, Daniel Webster, in his 1832 address on the centenary of Washington's birth, very much opposed sectionalism and the moves by various southern states to claim they had the power to nullify state laws on the grounds that Washington had favored a strong national union, again, as if this were the decisive consideration. Again, during the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, Lincoln was very clear that slavery should be imposed in part because Washington, although himself a slave owner, had been opposed to slavery. Since Washington, who was the great leader and founder of our country, had opposed to slavery, therefore the sort of policy Lincoln favored of having a forcible intervention against the southern states was also desirable. He was in the Washingtonian tradition, at least so he pictured himself. So, although then the picture is not an entirely unmixed one because of the farewell address, I think we can say on balance that Washington was a strong supporter of centralism within the context of his time and an opponent of limited government. James Madison, who somewhat repented of his earlier strongly centralist views, predicted once that there would be a crisis in American government because of the growth of Caesarism or dictatorship, and he predicted that this crisis would come about somewhere around 1930. His prediction proved to be accurate in part because of Washington's advocacy of centralism. We've been involved in that same crisis ever since. Thank you.